Hi students! In today's lecture, we will discuss the tissues that make up plants, as well as a little bit about how the plant's roots, leaves, flowers, and fruits function. Remember that it is important to listen carefully to the whole lecture and not to skip ahead. Let's begin by reviewing the tissues that make up a plant's organs. The first type of tissue is meristematic tissue. This type of tissue is special because it enables the plant to grow longer at the tips of the roots, here. Oops, sorry about that. There's my pen. Okay, so the meristematic tissue is found here at the tips of the roots, as well as at the top of the stem. And so the reason it's found in these areas is because these are the areas in which the plant grows. The cells that make up meristematic tissue are undifferentiated, which means that they have not decided on what kind of cell they are going to be yet, and so they have the possibility of becoming any kind of cell that the plant needs as it grows. The next type of tissue is dermal tissue. Dermal tissue forms the skin of the plant, or in other words, the outer covering. Just like your skin covers and protects your internal organs, the dermal tissue of the plant is a protective layer. In the diagram to the right, the dermal tissue is shown in blue. In each of these pictures, which are cross-sections, you can see that the outside of each cross-section is blue, indicating that it is covered in dermal tissue. If you're unfamiliar with that term cross-section, what it means is that we have cut the plant in certain places and you're looking at the surface which was cut. So that's why if you're cutting a tubular root, then the cross-section looks round. And so we have a cross-section through the root, through the stem, and through the leaf. And in each part, you can see that the dermal tissue covers the outer surface of the plant. Our next plant tissue is one we've discussed before, vascular tissue. Vascular tissue's job is to transport and store water. As we've already mentioned, there are two types of vascular tissue, xylem and phloem. These types of vascular tissues form vessels within the plant, kind of like the arteries and veins of your own cardiovascular system. The job of the xylem vessels is specifically to take water from the roots and up towards the top of the plant in a vertical direction. In contrast, the phloem transports food from the leaves to the rest of the plant, and so this food, which is dissolved into water, is moving in more of a horizontal direction, back and forth like this. If we look back at the cross sections, you can see the vascular tissue in purple is really found towards the middle of the plant. So even as we go up toward the stem, the vascular tissue breaks up into smaller sections, but still we kind of have to go to the inner part of the plant to find the vascular tissue. Then finally, the last type of tissue is ground tissue. I think of ground tissue as filler tissue. As you can see in our plant cross sections, the ground tissue is yellow and it is filling up the spaces in between the vascular tissue in the middle and the dermal tissue on the outside. All of this ground tissue can be utilized by the plant to do things such as store extra nutrients and provide support. All right, so now we're going to take a closer look at the roots of a plant. First, we should note that there's not just one type of root system. Instead, the overall structure of a plant's roots varies depending on the lifestyle and the needs of the plant. Some plants have a large central root from which others branch, like you can see here. Large central root and secondary roots here. Other types of plants that do not need to be anchored in quite such a deep way have more numerous thin, shallow roots, like this one that you see here. So there's no central root, but there's lots of thin, fibrous roots. However, one thing that all root systems have in common is that the roots are covered in microscopic elongations called root hairs. These root hairs are made of dermal tissue. You can see them in the diagram here. We have a single root, and these projections in green show the root hairs coming off of the root. They're exaggerated in this diagram. Normally they would be microscopic. I want you to notice that the root hairs are very thin, and that in fact the dermal tissue that makes up these root hairs in some spots is only one cell layer thick. So here I want you to pause and I want you to think about why. What are these root hairs, what might they be able to do for the plant, and why are they so thin, and what is the purpose of them? So I want you to make some inferences in the space below. And when I come back tomorrow to class, we'll discuss some of your ideas and check what you came up with. Okay, so the last thing I want us to take a look at is the end of the root. At the very tip of the root, there's a structure called the root cap. And this area is important because it contains some of that meristematic tissue we were talking about on our last slide. You can see it in here as well. The meristematic tissue is there to make new cells through a process that you're likely familiar with through your middle school science class. The process by which we make new cells is called mitosis. Again, so remember that because these are meristematic cells, they do not have a specified function yet, and the plant will, as it adds new cells, get to decide what kinds of cells those undifferentiated cells should end up becoming. So why is this all important? This is how a plant's roots grow longer. We need these root caps and these areas of meristematic tissue in order to add length to the roots. Next, we will look at the plant's shoot system. Just like we saw with the root system, the overall structure of a plant's shoot system also varies depending on the lifestyle and needs of the plant. You can see some of this variety in the picture to the right. Look at all the different leaf shapes and arrangements and positions on the stem. Each species of plant will have the shape and arrangement that best adapts it to its environment. All right, so let's begin by looking a little bit closer at the stems. The primary job of the stems is to house the vascular tissue. And you've probably observed this already. When you've cut the stems of flowers, you'll notice that there's fluid inside. That's because those stem structures are primarily to transport water throughout the plant. The stems of plants also bear leaves, and the primary job of the leaves is to be the site of photosynthesis, through which the plant will make food for itself. Now, another interesting anatomical feature of leaves is that they contain these microscopic openings called stomata. And so here in this diagram, if you were to blow up the surface of a leaf, if you take a little section like this and you blow it up, what you'll notice is that you have these microscopic holes. And the point of those holes, they can open and close as the plant needs, either to let carbon dioxide or oxygen in or out of the leaf. A final important feature of leaves is that they're covered in a waxy layer called a cuticle. And this is another one of those adaptations for living on land. Because the water is stored inside the plant, we need to have a way to make sure that that water doesn't evaporate and leave the plant too quickly. And so covering it in a cuticle or a waxy layer will help keep all of that water inside the plant. This is why often when you look at leaves like this one here, you can see a waxy or shiny layer on the outside. That's the cuticle. And this is also why water from the outside will form drops on the outside of the leaves, because that waxy layer is a waterproof layer. Got a couple more photos of this on the next slide. This top one here I've included just to show you a view of the cuticle in a diagrammatic form. It's the darkest green layer on the top of the leaf here. And then this one is from an electron microscope. You can see all the holes there are the stomata. And this diagram here as well kind of shows you how stomata can be opened and closed depending on what the plant needs. And then finally, I've included this picture here to show you that just like we said that the root systems and the shoot systems vary widely in their structure, so do flowers. And yeah, you can see that just by taking a quick look at the variety of shapes, sizes, colors, and stem positions that we see in the flowers in this diagram. And so we're going to actually look at flowers in more depth on the next slide. Okay, so in angiosperms, or our flowering plants, the flowers are used for reproduction. Interestingly, a flower actually contains both male and female reproductive organs in one flower. The male reproductive organ is called the stamen, and you can see that on the diagram here. I'll outline one. So there are several stamen in this particular flower, but here's the entire structure. You can see it's composed of a long filament and then a structure at the top called the anther. That the anther at the end of the stamen produces pollen. So that's this area right here. So pollen would be produced by this structure. And pollen is what contains the male reproductive cell that will participate in fertilization. The female reproductive organ in the flower is the carpel. And so I'll outline that one as well. The carpel is in the middle of the flower. It contains all of these structures. At the base of the carpel here, there is a chamber called the ovary. And so that's what we're looking at there. And it's the ovary that contains the female reproductive cell, which is the egg. Now, flowers are adapted to attract insects and other animals in order to transfer pollen located on the anther here. These little dots would represent pollen. And the idea is that the flower needs to attract pollinators to transfer the pollen from the stamen to the carpel of either the same flower. So we could do this where we transfer the pollen to the same flower, or to another flower elsewhere. And so I want you to think about some of the ways in which flowers are adapted to attract pollinators. And I want you to write your ideas here in this space. Okay, so you're just writing down what are some of the adaptations that flowers have in order to attract pollinators, and we will discuss them when I come back next time. All right, so when a pollen grain lands on the sticky ends of a carpel, okay, so here's, again, in our diagram, here's our pollen. Once it gets to the sticky end of the carpel, what will happen is that the male sex cell, which is within the pollen, will make a tunnel. It will burrow down the carpel. I'm going to just draw this little dash line. This yellow tube here represents the tube made by the burrowing male sex cell so that it will get down into the ovary of the plant. And here, fertilization will occur. All right, so once fertilization has occurred inside the ovary, what will be created, from the fertilized egg, are seeds. And we looked at seeds in our last lecture. We said that a seed would contain the baby plant embryo along with the endosperm, the nutrient supply, and it would be covered in a seed coat. And so depending on how many eggs are fertilized, there can be one seed, there can be many seeds. And what will happen here, once we have seeds in the ovary, is that the ovary will start to grow. Oops. Sorry, you can see that there. The ovary is growing and it will continue to grow. And as the ovary is swelling up, the flower will give way to what is becoming the fruit. So where the flower once was, a fruit grows. And so we've got the end of the diagram here. You can see the flower has completely diminished, and now we have a fruit containing the seeds, which will hopefully attract some animals that can disperse those seeds to new locations where they won't compete with the parent plant. All right, so that is it for our lecture today. I want you to take a look at Veracross to find the other work that you're expected to do, and I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Have a good night.